Hi, I'm going to go over uh, the quiz three right now, and this kind of serves as a discussion, a review. All these discussions of the quizzes serve as reviews for the first weeks of the class. So let's see here. What we talked about is the Spanish by the last 2 decades of the 1700s. They're starting to try to save money in Texas. The reason for that is by 1763, Louisiana, for a brief period until 1803 or so. It's kind of a complex story, which I won't bore you with. Anyway, for this 1763 to early 1800s, the Spanish control Louisiana, and so they don't have to worry about losing Texas. So they feel like they're secure in Texas, and so they start trying to save money in Texas. And one of the things they decide to do is to make a kind of peace with the Comanches by buying off the Comanches, by bribing Comanche chiefs, by giving them gifts. And this also happens in New Mexico. And so that's the important thing about 1785. The the Spanish and the Comanche make peace with one another, and the Spanish do this by giving the Comanche gifts. What's the surprise ending of Lone Star that both Sam and Pilar say share the same father? It's kind of Sales talking about how intermixed Texas history is. Kind of an intense ending, I think. How did Galvez help the American Revolution against the British? He sent cattle into to the American revolutionaries that were fighting the British. Let's see. Thomas Jefferson was the future U.S. president that wrote a letter thanking uh, Galvez. Pretty detailed question, but I want to make sure that you're listening and comprehending these documentaries that I'm posting. Let's see, and you'll find out this week that Jefferson tried to capture Texas uh, during his presidency in the early 1800s. The fajitas is the answer. The skirt steak, now fajitas, delicious, arbillos fajitas. Um, Very Tex-Mex thing. The gateway to Texas was San Juan Bautista, and this actually goes back much earlier. This goes back to 1700, uh, uh, when the Spanish are building an infrastructure into Texas. So the first question, by the 1780s, by the end of the 1700s, the Spanish are trying to save money in Texas by doing things like making peace with the Comanche, secularizing the missions so that the Spanish government doesn't have to support the missions anymore. So that's the second half. That's the end of the 1700s. At the beginning of the 1700s is when the Spanish renew their efforts to settle Texas. Which culminates in a Gallo coming up into Texas after the Chicken War in 1720. So the answer is the gateway into Texas, the mother mission of Texas, the San Juan Bautista. So in the 1700s, you see kind of a dynamic with the Spanish. Earlier in the 1700s, when they feel like they're going to lose Texas to the French, they start to focus on Texas and they start to spend money in Texas. At the end of the 1700s, the Spanish start attempting to pull resources from Texas, try to save money in Texas. One of the ways they do this, as I've already talked about, is they make peace with the Comanche. It was easier to bribe the Comanche than fight the Comanche. Now we're back to the earlier period here. And one of the reasons that the five missions were consolidated into what's now San Antonio is because this area had a lot of water. It had been a meeting ground, a meeting place for indigenous groups for probably well over 1,000 years. And these were the indigenous groups that we call under the umbrella phrase of the Colatecan. Although they were under that umbrella, there were many different types of indigenous groups. They there was a shared encampment, and these were the folks that were willing to work with the Spanish because they're getting attacked by the Lapon Apache. What's true about women in Spanish Texas? They had many more rights than women elsewhere in North America, especially British North America. They could own property. They had property rights. They could sue in Spanish courts, and they kept their property after they got married. None of this was true in British North America, like Boston, Philadelphia, New York City. So women in Spanish Texas had many more rights, legal rights, than did women in places like British North America. Let's see. Uh, the crime that I talk about in this, the shocking crime, the guy that sells the used tires, what he saw was Charlie Wade, who's played by Chris Christopherson, the evil sheriff, murders a driver who is transporting undocumented workers into Texas, kills them in cold blood. What is true of the indigenous people that entered the 5 Spanish missions in San Antonio? These native groups helped the Spanish fight the Lapon Apache, but by 1800, many had died by the time the Spanish government pulls its support from the mission of disease. But what's interesting and what we understand now is that the descendants, and by some estimates, 30,000 people in South Texas, especially in San Antonio, live in San Antonio to this day. So if your family has been in San Antonio for as long as you can remember, you should get a 23andMe and see if you have some indigenous blood. You might be surprised. I think that would be a pretty cool thing. I think so anyway. Um, let's see here. I never got 23andMe. I'm just a Irish mutt. In 1803, I misspelled Spanish. I see now. Embarrassing. The U.S. purchased Louisiana, and suddenly now Spanish Texas has a dangerous enemy, much more dangerous than the French ever were, the United States. And as I'm going to talk about this week, especially, Americans were very, very interested in coming into Spanish Texas, especially East Texas, because that was such a prime area for growing cotton and it had been completely uncultivated. So that's a very dangerous moment for the Spanish. And then, of course, it's quite dangerous for Mexican Texas as well, because as we know, in 1836, Anglos and their Tejano allies start a revolt in which Texas leaves Mexico. So the fact that Louisiana is U.S. is quite dangerous for both the Spanish and later the Mexican government in Texas. Who killed Charlie Wade? It's the sheriff, Hollis Pogue, the guy that's always kind of playing with his mustache. He shoots Charlie Wade because Charlie Wade's about to murder one of the characters in the movie. One of the key cattle center in Spanish Texas was Mission La Bahia near Goliad. That was one of the largest ranches. And remember, the missions often owned ranches. And it was cattle from La Bahia that was often, beginning in the late 1700s, it was taken into Louisiana on these cattle drives. We think of the cattle drives as something that happened after the Civil War, but they actually began in Texas 100 years earlier, especially from Mission La Bahia, Goliad, just down the San Antonio River from San Antonio. The branding of cattle began by the Spanish government because they wanted to tax the cattle and they needed to identify the cattle. So, okay, so that's the study guide or the answers for quiz 3.